The knock didn't sound urgent, which somehow made it worse. A slow, deliberate tapping that cut through the quiet of the apartment like someone who already knew they would be let in. And before I could react, I heard a voice through the door saying my name softly, carefully, the way it used to sound late at night when she wanted sex or forgiveness or both. And my chest tightened so suddenly it felt physical, like a hand closing around something I'd buried on purpose. My girlfriend lifted her head from my shoulder, her hair warm against my neck. Her body relaxed in a way that only comes from feeling safe, and she looked at me with that curious half-smile she always wore when something unexpected interrupted us. Not jealous, not threatened, just alert. And she slid off the couch slowly, deliberately, still wearing my shirt from earlier that evening, the fabric clinging to her in a way that made it impossible not to want her even with my pulse starting to race. Another knock followed, firmer this time, and the voice came again, closer now, and my girlfriend raised an eyebrow before walking toward the door barefoot, her hips moving with unconscious confidence, and I stayed frozen where I was because some instincts take longer to wake up than others, and I needed the distance, the extra seconds to convince myself this was really happening. I could hear them through the door, the muffled exchange as my girlfriend asked who it was in a calm, neutral tone, the kind she used with delivery drivers and strangers. And then there was a pause long enough to stretch thin, followed by a quiet inhale on the other side, and when the answer came it was soft, almost fragile, and said my name again, like a reminder, like a test. My girlfriend turned her head just enough to look back at me, eyes sharp now, assessing, and she didn't ask me anything, didn't whisper, didn't hesitate. She simply said, "Honey, your ex is here, and she says she really needs to talk to you." And the word ex landed heavier than the knock had, heavier than the voice, rearranging the air in the room. I stood up slowly, aware of my heartbeat, aware of the way my girlfriend didn't move aside yet, aware of the smell of rain seeping in through the crack under the door, mixed with a familiar perfume that dragged me backward 2 years without permission, to nights spent waiting and wondering and pretending I wasn't being abandoned in inches. And when my girlfriend finally opened the door fully, she didn't step back. She leaned against the frame instead, casual, unbothered, creating a living barrier between my past and my present. My ex stood there thinner than I remembered, makeup trying and failing to hide exhaustion, her eyes flicking immediately to my girlfriend's bare legs, the shirt she wore, the space behind her that was no longer hers, and the silence stretched until it became uncomfortable, intimate, loaded, and I felt my girlfriend's hand slide back to rest on my hip, possessive but steady, grounding me in the now. There was something undeniably sexual in that moment, not in bodies but in power, in the quiet understanding that whatever story was about to be told, whatever apology had been practiced, it was already being told on different terms. And when my ex finally said my name again, tentative and hopeful, I realized with a strange, calm certainty that the knock she'd chosen tonight had opened a door she was no longer prepared to walk through. My ex looked like she'd spent 2 years insisting she was fine until the lie finally started showing on her face, and the strangest part was that the version of her standing in my hallway still tried to wear confidence like armor, even though it fit badly now, even though her hands kept tightening around the strap of her bag as if she needed something to hold on to, while my girlfriend stayed exactly where she was, leaning on the doorframe with her bare feet planted like she'd been born there, and the contrast between them made the moment feel unfairly sharp, like my life had divided itself into before and after and decided to hold the line. My ex's eyes flicked over my shoulder into the apartment, taking inventory in a way that was almost automatic, and I watched her take in the softer lighting, the framed photos that weren't of her, the throw blanket my girlfriend had picked out because she liked the texture against her skin, and when her gaze returned to my girlfriend's face, it stalled there, because my girlfriend was smiling politely the way you smile at someone who has the wrong address. I didn't know she'd be here, my ex said, voice too careful, and my girlfriend's smile didn't change as she replied, "He lives here, so yes, I'm usually here." And it wasn't a cruel line. It was worse than cruel. It was effortless, and I saw my ex flinch as if the air itself had slapped her. My ex tried to recover by looking at me, by pulling the old move where she and I were the only real people in the room, but my girlfriend's hand was still at my hip, warm and steady, and it reminded me what it felt like to be chosen without conditions, and that reminder made it easier to keep my face neutral. "Can we talk?" my ex asked, and she said it like she expected me to step into the hallway alone with her, like she expected the rules from 2 years ago to still apply, and I almost felt sorry for her when she realized they didn't. My girlfriend tilted her head slightly, still calm, still in control, and asked, "About what exactly?" And my ex's mouth opened and closed once, because it's hard to be rehearsed when someone asks you a real question. I need to explain," she finally said, and I heard the word explain and felt an old anger stir, not loud, not explosive, but deep and exhausted, the kind that comes from remembering how many nights I had begged for a simple explanation and gotten nothing but distance and distraction and that maddening, "you're overreacting" tone. She stepped forward half a pace, stopping when she realized my girlfriend wasn't moving, and lowered her voice as if softness could rewrite the past. "I didn't handle it right," she said. "I know I didn't. But I had reasons, and I was scared, and things were complicated, and I wasn't thinking straight." The phrases came out in the same order they always do when someone is trying to make abandonment sound like an accident, and my girlfriend's eyes stayed on her, attentive in a way that almost made me feel exposed. "2 years is a long time to be scared," my girlfriend said gently, and my ex's eyes flashed with something like resentment because she wanted sympathy, not accuracy. The thing about seeing her again was how quickly my body remembered the old pattern, the pull and push of wanting her approval, even while hating what she did to me. And I hated that I could feel it try to wake up. That reflex to make things easier for her, to smooth the tension so she wouldn't be uncomfortable. And then my girlfriend shifted closer, not in a territorial way exactly, but in a quiet, intimate way that made my ex notice the difference between being tolerated and being wanted. My girlfriend's shoulder brushed my arm, and the contact sent a spark through me, not because it was dramatic, but because it was mine, because she did it without thinking, because she wasn't performing. My ex saw that spark and swallowed, and her voice changed, turning smaller, more emotional, like she was reaching for the version of me that used to cave when she looked wounded. "I didn't mean to leave like that," she said, eyes wet now, and I believed she didn't mean to in the moment, in the selfish way people don't mean to do things that benefit them, and that thought steadied me. My girlfriend stepped back just enough to give me space, but not enough to disappear, and I realized she wasn't trying to fight my battles for me. She was simply refusing to let my ex control the room. "You can talk," my girlfriend said, still polite, still unshaken. "But you're not going to come in here and pretend you didn't disappear without a word. So start from the part where you left, and tell it like it actually happened." My ex blinked at her as if she wasn't used to anyone demanding the truth out loud, and then she looked back at me, searching my face for permission to keep lying. And that was the moment I understood she hadn't come here because she missed me the way you miss a person. She'd come here because she missed the version of the world where she could walk away and still have the door open whenever she felt like returning. There's a particular kind of silence that follows abandonment, the kind that isn't peaceful but hollow, and as my ex stood there waiting for her turn to speak, that silence crept back into my chest and reminded me of the weeks after she left, when the apartment felt too big and every object carried the faint accusation of having been chosen together. And I remembered how I had sat on the edge of the bed night after night, phone in my hand, rereading old messages like they were clues instead of echoes, trying to understand how someone could disappear without even the decency of a goodbye. She hadn't packed slowly or argued or cried. She had simply removed herself from my life with surgical efficiency, and at the time I had been too stunned to notice how much she took with her beyond the obvious. The breakup didn't come with screaming or cheating confessions or dramatic scenes. It came with a casual distance that hardened into absence, and I told myself for months that the pain was just emotional, that heartbreak alone could knock the wind out of me like that, until the practical consequences started piling up in ways that were harder to ignore. Bills I hadn't known about, accounts I assumed were shared suddenly inaccessible, a creeping realization that while I had been trying to save the relationship, she had been quietly securing herself. I hadn't wanted to believe it then, because believing it meant admitting I had been naive, that I had trusted someone who saw me less as a partner and more as a resource, and that kind of realization hits deeper than jealousy ever could. I remembered the night I found the folder missing from my laptop, the one with drafts and projections and early contracts for something I'd been building on the side, something she had dismissed repeatedly as unrealistic, a waste of time, something she rolled her eyes at before pulling me into bed and distracting me with sex that felt generous, but always had an edge of impatience, like she was indulging a phase. When I asked her about the folder back then, she'd laughed and said I was being paranoid, kissed me until I forgot the question, and I hated myself a little now for how easily I had let desire replace clarity. After she left, the folder never reappeared, and at the time I told myself it must have been deleted accidentally, because the alternative was too ugly to look at. Standing there now, watching her shift her weight and glance around my home as if measuring what she used to own, I felt something settle into place with uncomfortable precision. And it wasn't rage, it was understanding. The slow recognition that heartbreak had been only part of the damage, and that the financial strain, the months of scrambling, the nights where I lay awake wondering how I'd been left so far behind, weren't random misfortunes but consequences of someone else's quiet decisions. My girlfriend must have felt the change in me because her hand tightened slightly at my hip, grounding me again, reminding me that I wasn't that version of myself anymore, the one who blamed himself for someone else's exit. The thing was, I hadn't rebuilt my life out of spite or revenge. I'd done it because survival demanded it, because lying in bed waiting for someone who wasn't coming back had nearly broken me, and the work that followed, the long hours, the careful rebuilding of trust in myself, had happened slowly and without spectacle, until one day I looked around and realized I wasn't struggling anymore. My girlfriend entered my life during that quiet rebuilding, not as a reward, but as a reminder that intimacy didn't have to come with anxiety, that sex could be warm and mutual and grounding instead of transactional, that attraction could grow without being used as leverage, and that realization had changed me more than I'd admitted. My ex didn't know any of that yet, didn't know what I'd lost or what I'd regained, and as she stood there rehearsing apologies in her head, I realized she also didn't know that the thing she'd taken when she left wasn't just a folder or an idea or a financial head start. It was my ability to trust my own instincts, something I'd had to claw back piece by piece. My girlfriend met my eyes then, not asking, not pushing, just present. And in that look I understood that whatever conversation was about to happen next, I wasn't going into it alone, and I wasn't going into it blind anymore. She finally spoke the way people do when they think honesty is a tone rather than content, voice low and careful, eyes fixed on a spot somewhere between my collarbone and the floor as if looking directly at me might trigger a verdict she wasn't ready to hear. And she said she'd made a mistake, that things hadn't worked out the way she'd imagined, that life had a way of humbling you when you least expect it. And every phrase sounded polished, practiced, like something she'd said aloud to herself enough times that it felt real. She talked about timing, about how she'd been overwhelmed back then, about how she hadn't known what she wanted and had been too afraid to admit it, and I noticed how none of her explanations ever quite touched the moment she left, never landed on the exact decision to disappear without a word, never acknowledged the nights I spent staring at my phone waiting for a message that never came. My girlfriend stayed quiet at first, which somehow made the room feel smaller, more focused, and when she did speak, her questions were gentle in a way that disarmed without apologizing, asking when exactly things started falling apart, asking what had changed recently that made this the right moment to show up unannounced, asking whether my ex had tried to reach out before tonight, and if so, why she hadn't followed through. Each question landed like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through the story my ex was trying to keep smooth, and I could see her recalculating in real time, adjusting details, hesitating just long enough to make the cracks visible. She said she'd thought about me often, that she'd missed me, that she'd compared everyone else to me and found them lacking, and the words might have meant something once, might have softened me back when I still needed her approval. But now they felt oddly hollow, like compliments delivered too late to matter. When she mentioned regret, it was always framed around what she'd lost rather than what she'd done, and I caught the way her eyes flicked around the apartment again, noticing the quiet order of it, the quality of things that had been chosen deliberately instead of inherited from a shared past. And something in her expression tightened, not with jealousy exactly, but with calculation. My girlfriend shifted closer to me then, close enough that I could feel the warmth of her body through the thin fabric of her shirt, close enough to remind me of the nights we'd spent tangled together without urgency, without games, sex that wasn't a currency, but a language. And that closeness steadied me as my ex continued, talking about how lonely she'd been, how hard the last year had been, how she'd realized that walking away from me had been the worst decision of her life. It was tempting, for half a second, to believe that loneliness had driven her back, that regret had finally matured into accountability. But the details kept slipping, the timelines not quite lining up, the emphasis always returning to now, to urgency, to how much she needed this conversation to happen tonight. When my girlfriend asked what had prompted her to come back specifically now, my ex hesitated, then said something vague about seeing updates, about hearing through mutual acquaintances that I was doing well, that I seemed happy. And the word happy landed between us with an unexpected weight, because it wasn't something she'd ever seemed interested in preserving when she had me. She said she hadn't realized what she'd had until it was gone, and maybe that was true in some abstract sense, but it wasn't love that sharpened her attention now. It was the realization that the story she'd told herself about me stagnating without her had been wrong. I watched her struggle to keep control of the narrative, watched my girlfriend's calm presence quietly dismantle it without raising her voice, and I felt something loosen inside my chest, a knot I hadn't realized I was still carrying, because I could finally see the pattern clearly, could finally understand that her return wasn't about unfinished business or unresolved feelings. It was about recalculating value after the fact. When she finished speaking, she looked at me expectantly, like the next line belonged to me, and I realized with a strange mix of relief and anticipation that the conversation was only just beginning, and that whatever reason she thought she had for coming back, it wasn't going to survive much longer under the light. The truth didn't come out all at once. It leaked, slow and inevitable, seeping through the gaps my ex couldn't seal no matter how carefully she chose her words, and I felt it crystallize the moment my girlfriend asked, almost casually, whether she'd seen the article last month, the one that mentioned my name in passing, because my ex's face changed before she could stop it, eyes widening just enough to betray recognition, and in that flicker, I saw the answer I hadn't even known I was waiting for. My ex laughed a little too quickly and said she didn't know what she meant, but her fingers tightened around her bag again, knuckles whitening, and the room seemed to tilt as the pieces slid into place. I remembered the way she'd dismissed my ideas back then, the way she'd rolled her eyes when I talked about building something of my own, about taking risks that didn't come with guarantees, and how she'd told me stability mattered more than dreams, right before she left with the parts of my life she thought were valuable and abandoned the rest. Now she stood there trying to convince me she'd come back for love, while her attention kept snagging on details that had nothing to do with feelings, the quiet confidence in my posture, the ease with which my girlfriend moved through the space, the absence of desperation she'd expected to find. My girlfriend didn't press her immediately, didn't accuse or raise her voice. She just asked another question, this one sharper beneath the politeness, about when my ex had first heard I was doing well, and the hesitation stretched longer this time, long enough that even my ex seemed to realize she'd been caught between honesty and the illusion of it. She admitted she'd heard things through mutual connections, seen updates online she hadn't expected, realized that the project she'd once laughed off had become something real, something profitable, something people were paying attention to, and the admission landed with a dull thud, not because it surprised me, but because it confirmed what I'd been circling around without naming. She tried to frame it as pride, as support from afar, as happiness for me that had grown into a desire to reconnect. But the way she spoke about it gave her away, the subtle possessiveness creeping back into her tone, the assumption that success rewrote history, that shared past equaled shared claim. She said things like we'd built it together, like she'd been there at the beginning, like walking away didn't dissolve whatever entitlement she believed she still had. And something cold settled in my chest as I realized she wasn't just here to apologize. She was here to reinsert herself into a story that no longer belonged to her. My girlfriend stepped closer to me then, not touching this time, just aligning herself at my side, and I felt the quiet solidarity of it, the understanding that we were seeing the same thing from different angles. And she said gently, "So you didn't come back because you missed him?" And the silence that followed was louder than any accusation, because my ex didn't deny it. She just looked at the floor like someone who's been asked a question too late to answer well. When she finally spoke, she said she thought we could talk about things, figure out what was fair, and the word fair made me almost laugh, because fairness had never factored into the way she left or what she took. In that moment, whatever lingering attraction I might have felt evaporated, replaced by a clarity that was almost soothing, and I saw her for what she was now. Not the woman I'd loved, but someone recalculating after realizing she'd made the wrong bet. My girlfriend met my eyes, and there was something quietly intimate in that exchange, a shared recognition that this was the turning point, the moment the mask slipped far enough that it couldn't be put back on, and as my ex waited for a response, for reassurance, for leverage, I understood that she hadn't returned because she wanted me. She'd returned because she wanted what I'd become, and that difference changed everything. What surprised my ex wasn't anger or shouting or even rejection. It was my girlfriend stepping aside and opening the door wider, gesturing inward with a composed little nod as if she were inviting a neighbor in for tea, rather than allowing the past to cross a threshold it had forfeited long ago. And I felt my ex hesitate, caught between relief and suspicion, before she stepped inside, her shoes leaving faint damp marks on the floor I'd cleaned earlier that evening. The apartment seemed to hold its breath around us, familiar and safe in a way that made her presence feel intrusive, and my girlfriend closed the door behind her gently, deliberately, the sound final enough to make my ex glance back at it as if measuring exits. "Sit wherever you like," my girlfriend said, her voice warm but controlled, and my ex perched on the edge of the chair rather than the couch, as though she didn't trust herself to relax, while my girlfriend remained standing for a moment longer, leaning against the counter with her arms crossed loosely, watching, observing, not dominating the room, but unmistakably anchoring it. I stayed near her without thinking, close enough that our shoulders brushed when I shifted my weight, and the contact sent a quiet pulse through me, intimate and grounding, a reminder of the nights we'd spent like this after sex, bodies still humming, talking without guards. My ex started to speak again, something about appreciating the chance to explain, but my girlfriend interrupted softly, not rudely, just decisively, and said she wanted to be clear about something first, that she wasn't here to referee emotions or compete for attention, that she cared about me and about honesty, and that meant understanding the full picture. The words landed gently but firmly, and I saw my ex tense, her confidence faltering as she realized this wasn't going to be a performance she could control. My girlfriend continued, explaining that when she and I had started seeing each other, I'd been cautious, guarded in a way that suggested more than just a broken heart, and that curiosity had led her to ask questions, to listen closely, to notice inconsistencies in the stories I told myself about what had happened. She spoke about helping me sort through the practical aftermath of the breakup, the financial confusion, the missing information, the subtle patterns that only became obvious when someone wasn't emotionally attached to protecting a version of the past. And as she talked, I watched my ex's posture stiffen, watched the color drain from her face inch by inch. There was nothing accusatory in my girlfriend's tone, no triumph, just a calm laying out of facts, and I felt a flicker of attraction sharpen into something deeper, something rooted in trust and respect rather than heat alone, because this was intimacy too, this steadiness, this willingness to stand in uncomfortable truth without flinching. My ex tried to laugh it off, tried to say my girlfriend was reading too much into things, but the protest sounded thin even to her own ears. And when my girlfriend mentioned specific dates, moments, details I hadn't remembered sharing. My ex's gaze snapped to me, wide with a question that had already been answered. I hadn't told my girlfriend everything outright, not in confessions or dramatic revelations, but in fragments, in late-night conversations where vulnerability slipped out between kisses and hands roaming lazily, where trust built itself quietly over time. The room felt charged now, not with hostility but with exposure, and my girlfriend finally pushed off the counter and moved closer, stopping just short of my ex's personal space, her presence calm and undeniable. "I think you came back because you thought he'd still be waiting," she said evenly, "and because you thought what he built would still be accessible to you." My ex swallowed hard, her eyes flicking between us, and I realized she was starting to understand that this wasn't a confrontation she could win by charm or history. My girlfriend stepped back then and reached for my hand, threading her fingers through mine without looking, and the simple intimacy of it made my ex look away, because in that moment it was clear she wasn't just facing me. She was facing the version of me who had already moved on, already chosen differently, and already stopped needing her to explain herself at all. My girlfriend didn't raise her voice or change her expression when my ex tried to pivot back to emotion, saying she felt attacked, and that this was supposed to be a conversation about us, because my girlfriend's calm had nothing to do with sympathy and everything to do with preparation, and she reached into the drawer by the entryway like she'd done it 100 times, pulling out a slim folder that looked boring enough to be harmless until she set it on the coffee table between us like a boundary made of paper. My ex stared at it as if it might bite, then looked at me with the old expectation that I'd step in and smooth things over. And I didn't, because my throat felt tight with the memory of how many times I'd been talked out of my own instincts. "You can tell your story," my girlfriend said, still polite, still even. "But we're going to keep it anchored to facts, because facts don't shift depending on who's crying." My ex's mouth parted like she wanted to protest, but she didn't, because the folder had changed the air in the room from dramatic to procedural, from pleading to evidence, and people who live on charm hate being dragged into the light of receipts. My girlfriend opened the folder slowly, not theatrically, just with the careful precision of someone handling something important, and she slid the first page toward my ex without touching her, a printout of a bank statement with a handful of transactions highlighted in pale yellow. "Do you recognize these?" she asked, and my ex glanced down, then up too quickly, shaking her head before her eyes had even finished reading. My girlfriend didn't react to the lie. She simply flipped to the next page, then the next, building a pattern the way you build a case. Dates aligned with weekends my ex had insisted on running errands alone. Small transfers that looked harmless until you saw how consistent they were, how they added up, how they coincided with the last months of our relationship when I was exhausted and distracted and trying to fix what I thought was just distance. My ex's breathing changed, and I noticed the way she pressed her thighs together slightly, a nervous habit she used to have when she felt exposed, and my brain flashed back to nights when she'd use sex to reset the mood after a fight, to make me feel wanted enough to stop asking questions. That memory didn't warm me anymore. It sharpened something in me, because I could finally see the strategy for what it was. Not intimacy, not passion, but a shortcut to silence. Then my girlfriend pulled out the emails, a neat stack with timestamps in the corner, printed conversations between an address I recognized and one I didn't, and my ex's face went gray when she saw her own name in the header, because it wasn't my name she'd been talking to. It was someone who'd had an interest in what I was building before it ever made money, someone who'd asked for early materials, workflow notes, draft projections, and my ex had replied like she was doing them a favor. She tried to speak, tried to explain, but the words jammed up as my girlfriend calmly pointed out how the messages lined up with the missing folder on my laptop, how the attachment sizes matched the files that vanished, how there were references to documents my ex had sworn she'd never seen, and I felt the room tilt again, not from shock this time, but from the sick relief of confirmation, because uncertainty is its own form of torture, and I'd lived in it for too long. My ex whispered that it wasn't like that she hadn't meant harm, that she'd just been trying to protect herself, and my girlfriend's eyes narrowed slightly, not with anger, but with focus. "Protect yourself from what?" she asked, and my ex's gaze flicked to me, then away, because the answer was obvious. She'd been protecting herself from being tied to me if I failed, and securing her position if I succeeded. My girlfriend slid one last page across the table, a timeline she'd made that connected dates, transfers, emails, and the day my ex disappeared, and the neatness of it was devastating because it showed intent without needing a confession. My ex stared at it for a long moment, lips trembling, and when she finally looked up, her eyes were wet. But it wasn't the clean remorse I'd once dreamed of. It was panic, because she understood now that she hadn't walked into a reunion. She'd walked into a record of what she'd done, and for the first time since she'd arrived, she wasn't asking to be loved. She was calculating how much damage control she had left. The silence that followed felt different from the ones before, heavier but cleaner, like something rotten had finally been exposed to air, and my ex sat there staring at the papers as if they might rearrange themselves into a kinder story, if she waited long enough, while my girlfriend watched her with a calm that had nothing to do with mercy and everything to do with certainty. When my ex finally spoke, her voice shook as she asked what we were planning to do with all of that, and the question itself revealed how far she'd misunderstood the situation, because she still thought this was about leverage or punishment or revenge, still thought she was negotiating. My girlfriend tilted her head slightly, considering, then said something that made my ex stiffen in her chair. "We didn't plan to do anything," she said. "This isn't about action. It's about clarity." The words seemed to confuse her more than any accusation would have, because people who operate on manipulation expect reaction, not composure. My girlfriend continued, explaining that after the breakup, when I'd been trying to make sense of what I'd lost and why, we'd noticed something else, a pattern in how certain information about my life became visible at very specific times, how updates about my work circulated just enough to reach the kind of people who'd once dismissed it, and how none of it crossed into bragging or baiting, just presence. She talked about boundaries we'd set intentionally, about legal structures and public filings that were necessary anyway but also transparent, about how someone who was genuinely indifferent would never notice, but someone who felt entitled would. My ex's eyes narrowed as she listened, a slow understanding dawning that made her grip the edge of the chair. "You're saying you wanted me to come back," she said, accusation and disbelief tangled together, and my girlfriend shook her head gently. "No," she replied. "We knew that if your interest was about him, you wouldn't. But if it was about what he built, you would." The distinction landed like a verdict, because it reframed my ex's return not as fate or coincidence, but as confirmation. I watched the realization hit her in stages, watched her pride recoil and her fear step forward, and I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and sadness, because part of me had once loved this woman deeply, had imagined a future where she stood beside me when things finally worked, and now I was watching her understand that she'd been predicted, that her behavior fit a pattern so cleanly it could be tested. My girlfriend wasn't smug about it, didn't smile or gloat. She just stated it the way you state a result after running an experiment, and that made it worse for my ex, because there was no villainy to latch onto, no cruelty to fight against, only her own reflection staring back at her from the evidence and the timing. My ex tried to reframe again, insisting that none of this meant she didn't care, that people could have complicated motivations, that wanting stability didn't cancel out love, and for a moment, the old ache stirred in me, that familiar pull toward believing her, because it would be easier than fully letting go. Then my girlfriend reached for my hand, squeezing once, grounding me in the present, and I remembered the difference between love that shows up when it's hard and interest that shows up when it's profitable. My girlfriend spoke again, softer this time, and said, "If you'd come back when he was struggling, this would be a very different conversation." And my ex flinched because she knew it was true, knew she'd been absent when there was nothing to gain. The room felt smaller now, not because of tension, but because the illusion of choice had collapsed, and my ex finally asked the question she should have asked first, the one she'd avoided because she'd assumed the answer. "So what happens now?" she said quietly, and I realized this was the moment I'd been moving toward all night, not with anger or triumph, but with a clarity I hadn't had 2 years ago. My girlfriend looked at me then, not for permission but for alignment, And in that look, I felt the depth of our partnership, the way she'd stood beside me not to fight my battles, but to make sure I saw them clearly. I took a breath, steady and deliberate, and understood that whatever happened next wouldn't be a reaction to my past, but a decision rooted firmly in who I'd become. I realized I'd been quiet for a long time, long enough that my ex started filling the silence with nervous movements, smoothing her hair, adjusting her bag, glancing at the door like it might open itself if she stared hard enough. And when I finally spoke, my voice sounded steadier than I expected. Not sharp, not raised, just clear in a way that surprised even me. I told her I didn't need explanations anymore, that I'd spent 2 years replaying her absence from every possible angle, and that none of the versions had given me anything useful except exhaustion, and that whatever closure she thought she was offering was something I'd already built for myself. She looked at me like she was searching for the man who used to soften when she sounded fragile, and when she didn't find him, her expression shifted into something closer to disbelief. She tried one last time to reach for intimacy, not physical but emotional, reminding me of inside jokes, of trips we'd planned, of the chemistry we used to have, and for a moment I could almost feel the ghost of that attraction, the pull of familiarity that mistakes itself for destiny. But then my girlfriend moved closer, her presence firm and warm at my side, and the difference was undeniable. This wasn't passion fueled by uncertainty or sex used as a reset button after conflict. This was desire rooted in trust, in shared nights and honest mornings. And I felt it steady me as I told my ex that chemistry without respect had nearly ruined me once, and that I wasn't interested in repeating the experiment. My ex's eyes filled again, but this time the tears didn't move me, because they felt like the final tool in a kit that had stopped working. And she asked if there was really nothing left between us, if 2 years could erase everything we'd been. And I answered honestly, telling her that time hadn't erased it. It had clarified it, that what we'd had was real but incomplete, built on imbalance and unspoken transactions I hadn't understood until it was over. I told her that I'd learned the hard way that love shouldn't feel like something you're constantly auditioning for, and that realization alone had been worth the pain of losing her. The room felt quiet, but not tense now, like a storm that had already passed, and my girlfriend stepped forward then, not to speak for me, but to act, walking to the door and opening it with the same calm confidence she'd had when this night began. She didn't rush, didn't make a show of it. She just held it open and waited, and that simple gesture carried more finality than any argument could have. My ex looked at the open doorway, then back at me, and for the first time all evening there was no calculation in her eyes, only the dawning understanding that this was it, that there would be no dramatic reconciliation, no last-minute reversal, no lingering thread to pull on later. She stood slowly, shoulders slumping as if the weight of the evening had finally landed, and walked toward the door without another attempt to touch me, pausing only long enough to say she hoped I'd be happy, a phrase that sounded less like a wish and more like an admission of defeat. My girlfriend stepped aside to let her pass, polite to the end, and when the door closed behind her the sound was soft but absolute, sealing something shut that had been open far too long. I stood there for a moment, breathing, feeling the strange lightness that comes from choosing yourself without anger, and when I turned to my girlfriend she was already looking at me with a quiet smile that held pride, relief, and desire all tangled together. She reached for me then, fingers sliding into my hair, pulling me down into a kiss that was slow and grounding, not celebratory but affirming. And as I wrapped my arms around her, I felt the last of the tension leave my body, replaced by the certainty that the door hadn't just closed on my past. It had opened fully into a future I no longer needed to protect from anyone. After the door shut, the apartment felt different, not quieter exactly, but settled, like something unfinished had finally reached its natural end, and I stood there for a moment longer than necessary, listening to my own breathing, noticing how steady it was, how unchanged, because 2 years ago an encounter like that would have wrecked me for days. My girlfriend didn't rush me or fill the space with commentary. She just leaned back against the counter and watched me with that familiar calm, the kind that had nothing to prove. And when I finally turned toward her, she smiled softly and held out her arms. Not dramatic, not possessive, just open, and I stepped into them without hesitation. We didn't talk right away, because some moments don't need words to be complete, and I felt the warmth of her body through the thin fabric of her shirt, felt the slow rhythm of her breathing sync with mine, and there was something deeply grounding about the intimacy of it, the way her hands rested on my back like they belonged there, because they did. When she finally spoke, it wasn't about my ex or what had happened. It was about asking if I was okay, really okay. And I surprised myself by answering honestly that I was, not relieved, not triumphant, just calm in a way I hadn't been before. That calm mattered more than any sense of victory ever could. Later, stretched out together on the couch, legs tangled, her head resting on my chest, I thought about how much energy I'd once spent imagining what it would feel like if my ex ever came back. How I'd rehearsed conversations in my head where she apologized perfectly, and I finally felt seen, and how hollow those fantasies felt now compared to the reality of what I had. The truth was, she hadn't come back because she missed me. She'd come back because she'd miscalculated my worth, because she'd assumed I'd stay frozen at the point she left me, and realizing that didn't hurt the way it might have once, it just clarified things. My girlfriend traced idle patterns on my arm as we talked quietly about mundane things, about plans for the weekend, about a trip we'd been considering, about nothing important and everything important at the same time. And there was a subtle, steady desire humming between us, not urgent, but alive, the kind that grows out of trust and shared experience rather than uncertainty. When we eventually moved toward the bedroom, it wasn't about reclaiming anything or proving something to the ghost that had just left. It was about choosing each other again, deliberately, the way we always did. Lying there afterward, the room dim and familiar, I realized that the most satisfying part of the night wasn't watching my ex leave or seeing her finally understand what she'd lost. It was the absence of any urge to chase that understanding, the freedom of knowing I didn't need her regret to validate my growth. What stayed closed wasn't just the door she'd walked through. It was the version of myself that needed permission to move on, the part that equated being wanted with being worthy. In the end, there was no dramatic epilogue, no public reckoning, no final message sent or received, just a quiet certainty that some doors are better left unopened, not out of spite, but out of self-respect. I fell asleep that night with my girlfriend's hand resting over my heart, feeling the simple, profound satisfaction of having become unreachable to the person who once walked away, not because I built walls, but because I built a life that no longer had room for someone who only showed up when the work was already done.